In this segment, I'm going to talk through the distinction between a moderation and a mediation. And granted, we have not covered mediation yet, but I want to give you sufficient information on mediation only insofar as it's going to enable you to make this distinction. This is really important to know. The difference between moderation and mediation is essential for all the research that we do in our fields. First, let's look at the mediation here up top. This is depicted as kind of a chain where we have the IV impacting causally a mediator, and in turn that mediator causally impacts the DV. So the mediation technique or idea answers the question why. Why does the IV impact the DV? And the answer is through the mediating mechanism of whatever this mediator variable is. So a classic example I think we can relate to across both of our fields is the Eisen theory of planned behavior, and I put a couple of notes about that in the notes section below the slide. And so basically what that model proposes is that attitudes toward a given behavior will impact the behavior itself through intentions to perform that behavior. So if we have a very favorable attitude toward a behavior, we will form intentions to perform it, and then we will perform it. And for obvious reasons, this theory is extremely popular across our fields because we want to increase we want to solidify the link a lot of times between attitudes and behaviors, because a lot of times that link is weak. We have favorable attitudes towards something, but we don't generally do those behaviors. So for reasons of helping people improve their well-being, we want to make this link stronger a lot of times. Now, there are some moderators that can break this causal chain. For example, there's the mediator, pardon my bird, there's the moderator, I should say, of social norms around us. So if we have social norms that are strong against performing a certain behavior, then we can have very favorable attitudes toward the behavior, but it may never make it to intentions, those attitudes. If there is a moderator on this link, or this A path we call it, and this is the B path, but if we have a moderator on this A path, and there's a Z here, imagine a Z just sitting here, and that Z is the social norms. Social norms can buffer that relationship, make it dissipate. It can take this arrow away. That causation just boop, disappears because those social norms against the behavior are so strong that even if we have favorable attitudes, we're never going to intend to perform the behavior. So there are moderators that have been proposed and examined empirically for the theory of planned behavior, both on the A path and the B path. So this is not like a perfect, obviously, chain, and life never is, right? There are factors that interfere, right? But just know that mediation is about causality, primarily, and we will talk more about that later, and that there's causal links on both the A and the B paths. And another helpful way to make the distinction is that mediation answers the question why. Why does the IV impact the DV? And the answer is through this mediator or set of mediators. Sometimes there are more than one. Now let's move to moderation. Moderation answers the question when. When does the IV correlate or impact the DV or cause the DV? So the relationship from X to Y may be causal. If this is an experiment, then we can infer causality. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. So this is where things get a little bit sticky because mediation and moderation are so similar. The only difference is that in moderation, there can be no causality between these two. If there is either empirical evidence in the past studies that show causality, or imply causality, or if you theorize that X causes X causes Z or Z causes X, could go either way. If you suspect that, then it needs to be tested as a mediation, because any results that you do from testing a moderation when there's a causality here are necessarily going to be flawed. Now, this is the whole idea of model specification. If we propose a moderation when instead it's a mediation, there's a causal link here, then we're going to make wrong inferences to people, and it happens all the time, but we want to try to avoid it, right? And this moderation is automatically a mediation if there's a causal relationship here. So it's a misnomer to say it's a moderation if there's a causal link here. It's just a mediation, so it should be tested as a mediation. Now, where it gets sticky, I think the theory side of research is much harder than the stats, and the stats is pretty hard. It's a little bit complicated, but the theory part is really difficult because in my lab, on my RVT, we can spend days trying to figure out if there's a causal link to the here. And in the end, we never really know, right? So anytime there's a moderation proposed in our lab, we have to sit and think through, is there any causal link between these two? And if we think there might be, then it just has to be tested as mediation instead, which we'll learn about later. We're going to talk about mediation, the theoretical side in this class, and then you're going to go on to the stat side coming up with Dr. Bicus in the next class in the spring. Remember, causality has the three conditions. There's the temporal precedence condition. The cause has to come prior to the effect in time. Second, there's a statistical correlation. And third, all other reasonable explanations have been ruled out. And that last one is the hard one because it's never really done. We're always in the process of trying to figure out causality and figure out if there are confounds and other things causing that relationship to look like it's causal when it's not, right? And confusing us in that regard. So the two first ones are fairly easy to establish. Of the 3 points, the temporal precedence is pretty easy, and the statistical conclusion validity, meaning that's statistical correspondence, that's just a straight correlation. You correlate these two, and you've already met the first two conditions of causality. But the third one, ruling out the other potential causes, is really tough. It just takes a long time and years of research, so we don't ever really know for sure about causality, but causality just means that X is responsible for changing Z, or vice versa. And if we ever think that that's the case, if changes in Z are going to be responsible for changes in X, or the other way around, then that is immediately a mediation instead. All right, so that's the distinction. We can have no causal relationship here, and of course that's impossible to ever prove, but it's just one of those things we have to do our best with it. All right, so know that distinction. Also, just as a side note, for ideal conditions for increasing power to detect a moderation, which is just notoriously difficult for reasons we'll get into, but the X and the Z shouldn't be correlated super highly with each other. If they are, it's still possible to detect the moderation and have the adequate power to do so. It's just going to be harder. Let me say it this way. It will lower the power. It's still possible to find it, but the power just won't be as good to do so. All right, so that is the distinction. I want you to be able to articulate that, understand that mediation answers the question why two things are related, or there's an impact, why that happens, versus moderation is when. When does X correlate with Y, or not correlate with Y, as it were, or impact it causally? So again, this could be causal or not causal. Also, to increase power, just a quick side, this relationship has to be pretty strong. So again, it talks about that in the reading. And then one more thing I wanted to point out, and that is, we'll talk about this later, but the moderator and the IV can be interchanged and statistically, it's the same analysis. So we really have to think through theoretically what our predictor is. And I'll talk about that more coming up, but just to say that experts talk about if we have an experiment. So under the cases of an experiment where we are manipulating this, we're putting people into 2 or 3 groups, and then we're understanding their standing on a particular outcome after we give them certain stimuli, certain intervention, whatever it is. But we expect that there's a personal attribute of those people that will make the intervention more or less effective. So for example, we expect that people's conscientiousness levels or their, I don't know, what would we say? Some other personality trait that they have, neuroticism maybe, will make this intervention effect more or less in terms of its impact on the DV of interest. Right? So you can think of theoretical situations where we would expect that a given intervention or stimuli will impact someone differently depending on their personal attributes, right? Maybe their past experiences with something. So it is really important to, in that case, according to experts, ensure that the moderator is specified as that individual difference variable rather than the IV. Because you can not manipulate just the moderator. That is never supposed to be done. I'm sure there are exceptions and people have done it, but according to experts, and I'm not going to get into all the details of why, so this is in the bin of understand the main point, but not all the reasons why, because I'm not going to even go there. But people who are theorists and who are statisticians pretty much agree that if you're going to manipulate something, if you're going to manipulate putting people into 2 therapy groups, intervention of some kind, present them with some kind of stimuli, and then maybe a scenario where they have to, where you're judging their attitudes toward the scenario, or asking them their behavior, what would they do if they were in that scenario, all those kinds of experiments. And I run a lot of those kind in my lab on my RBT. The causal one that's manipulated, the variable that's manipulated, whatever that is, that causal link must be the IV and not the moderator. The moderator is always the individual difference variable that's interacting with the IV, that manipulation, whatever it is, to impact the DV. Now, in classic experiments, we can also manipulate the IV and the moderator. That is also allowed. What is not allowed is to manipulate a moderator and have an individual difference variable or continuous something attribute of the person here, gender, for example. So it is not appropriate to look at gender relating to some kind of DV and manipulate something here and expect that to change. It is most appropriate to put that IV that's being manipulated as the X variable, and then the individual difference, gender, whatever we're looking at, as a moderator. Always, always, always. So X can be manipulated, and both X and Z can be manipulated. But Z alone should never be manipulated, right? And X being something that's not manipulated. Always, right? So, and I'm sure again that it's done, and I've had people ask me, long story. I won't get into all the details, but I've had people ask me in the past, like, is it appropriate to have an intervention where we're trying to mitigate something of the individual difference? And I think that makes a lot of sense from a social justice perspective, human rights perspective. We want to see if, like, neuroticism in someone's performance, if we can lessen that link by doing some IV. But the whole thing is that if we're going to have a causal relationship, it has to be here. And that causal relationship has to be denoted here, and it just can't come from here alone. And so there are certain reasons for that that are not important for this class. So all you need to know is the main gist and not the reasons why. If you want to know the reasons why, I do have notes on that. I will consider putting them in the notes below this slide for those of you who are super ambitious. But otherwise, I think that it might be a distraction from the main dish, and so we're going to move on, but just have the main idea. All right, so we're going to move on now to certain types of moderations or interactions that we'll talk about in this class.